They never meant for you to know this. In fact, they counted on you being too distracted, too domesticated, too obedient. But once you hear it, really hear it, you'll never see history the same way again. This isn't a ghost story. This is a confession carved into the bones of America and hidden in the walls of a mansion for 113 years. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you inherited a house and found out it wasn't just a house? What if every room echoed with secrets no one alive should know? And what if those secrets were wrapped in silk and velvet, smiling down at you from dusty portraits of a family that once ran an entire town like a private kingdom? The Blackridge family. That name doesn't ring bells in history books. That's by design. But in the sleepy New England town of Hollow Creek, they were more than aristocrats. They were the unseen hand behind every job, every church, every school, every birth, every death. They didn't just control the economy, they controlled the people, and behind the opulent walls of their Victorian estate, they played a long game, one that spanned generations. The year is 2019. A freelance journalist named Sarah Collins inherits the Blackridge estate from an aunt she barely remembers. What should have been a blessing quickly turns into a descent, into something old, cold, and calculated. The house breathes secrets. The floorboards groan under the weight of rituals, and behind one child's bedroom wall, she finds it. An alcove, a shrine, a memory vault. Inside, neatly folded clothes from decades past. Dozens of diaries, each penned by a boy named Thomas. Each one welcomed into the Blackridge family, each one staying exactly 365 days. None of them ever left. What you're about to witness is not folklore. This is the anatomy of a hidden system, one that fed on the poor, demanded blood for power, and left no paper trail. But it left walls, and those walls tell everything. This is not just about the Blackridge family, it's about the lie of innocence, the illusion of progress, the idea that evil wears horns. No. Sometimes it wears cufflinks, drinks brandy by the fire, and signs checks to the local orphanage. You ready to go deeper? Because this isn't a rabbit hole. It's a grave. You want the truth? Then forget everything you think you know about good families, noble legacies, or small-town charm. Because what Sarah Collins found inside the Blackridge estate wasn't just shocking. It was a blueprint of generational manipulation, a perfect system hidden behind the polite smiles of Connecticut's elite. Let's start with the basement. She found the entrance on her second night, concealed behind a false panel in the butler's pantry. Multiple locks, layers of steel, even a rusted iron bar bolted in decades ago. This wasn't a place meant to be visited, it was meant to be forgotten, sealed off, buried in memory. The key had long since vanished, but Sarah, driven by instinct and something deeper, found her way in. The air was colder, not just physically, existentially, the kind of cold that comes from knowing this space was built for something permanent, something dark. She descended, step by creaking step. What she discovered wasn't just a room, it was a chamber. Stone walls, clearly not part of the house's original construction, lined the perimeter. Their texture wasn't just rough, it was carved, with symbols, not random graffiti or teenage rebellion. These were ancient, esoteric, and eerily precise, glyphs that scholars spend decades deciphering, etched here in perfect repetition, in a language that predated English, a dead tongue, still speaking. At the center stood a slab, a table, no, an altar, carved from a single piece of black granite, heavy, cold, stained. Channels ran along its edges, grooves, like those found on sacrificial stones in lost civilizations. But this wasn't Peru, or Egypt. This was Connecticut. And yet, here it was, ritual architecture sitting beneath a mansion built in 1906. And hanging above it, suspended from the ceiling by hooks and wires, were instruments, surgical tools, some modern, some ancient, and all used. Not museum pieces, not props. They bore the evidence, scratches, dried residue, fine hairline fractures where metal had cracked under pressure. In the corner, shelves of books, hand-bound, faded, written in multiple languages, Latin, Aramaic, and English, barely legible. They weren't journals, they were manuals, ritual procedures, charts, timelines, feeding schedules. Feeding. It's that word that caught her breath. It repeated again and again throughout the notes. Ensure optimal feeding. Prepare Thomas for feeding phase. Blood work consistent with previous specimens. Specimens. That's what they called them. Thomas wasn't a name. It was a designation. Imagine the weight of that realization. Thomas wasn't a boy. Not really. He was a role, a function, a cog in a cycle so old it had become ritual, tradition, almost holy. And the Blackridge family. They weren't caretakers. They weren't educators. They were engineers. Of fear, of flesh, of energy. Sarah flipped through the books with trembling hands. The language was clinical, detached. Not the tone of a madman, but of a scientist, a priest, someone who believed in what they were doing. Phrases like life extension protocol active, neural compliance intact. Subject demonstrates elevated endocrine yield at 13 years. They weren't killing Thomas. They were harvesting him, over and over, every 17 years. Each Thomas brought in on his 12th birthday. Loved, fed, schooled, conditioned, then bled, sacrificed, assimilated into a cycle of power the family believed was their divine right. And the most terrifying part? It worked. Sarah found medical records, handwritten, typed, faxed. Generations of Blackridge elders showing zero signs of aging past their mid-50s, even well into their 80s and 90s. No cancer, no dementia, no degenerative disease, just continuity. They called it the blood-heir doctrine, a practice believed to originate in pre-Roman Europe, a belief that a child on the cusp of adolescence, specifically a male, held the highest concentration of life potential, that if extracted under precise conditions and with the proper ritual context, this energy could be transferred, consumed, not symbolically, literally, but it required purity, obedience, willing containment. That's why they raised him like a prince for 365 days. That's why the family portraits showed smiles lined with guilt. They didn't just use Thomas, they worshipped him. And every 17 years the ritual repeated, generation after generation. As the world moved on, wars, inventions, revolutions, the Blackridge cycle remained untouched. Because no one suspected them. No one investigated the powerful, especially not the philanthropic family who built libraries, hospitals, and schools. But the cost? One boy, every 17 years. And you know what's worse? Families volunteered. Desperate, indebted, manipulated, they offered their sons to the Blackridges. For money, forgiveness, salvation. But Sarah knew what she'd found wasn't just about one family. It was a window into something older, a belief system beneath civilization, a system that runs the world still, in shadows, in boardrooms, in blood. You feel it too, don't you? You were never meant to hear this. When Sarah stepped out of that basement, she wasn't the same woman who walked into that house. She had touched something ancient, something hungry. But here's what they don't want you to understand. This wasn't about occultism. This wasn't some isolated act of rural madness. This was infrastructure, a system, and it wasn't just the Blackridges. They were one node, one branch of a larger root. Sarah's instincts screamed it. She scoured the family's private library, locked behind a false bookshelf, only accessible by triggering a hidden latch carved into the lion's head of a Victorian fireplace mantel. Inside were documents far more dangerous than any dusty diary or faded photograph. There were ledgers, coded financial records showing off-the-books transactions between the Blackridges and unnamed benefactors stretching back to 1908, Swiss accounts, shipments, biological samples, special transfers, entire balance sheets labeled only with astrological dates and blood types. There were photographs, old but pristine, and in one of them, dated 1931, Sarah recognized a man shaking hands with Arthur Blackridge III in front of the estate gates. That man, He later became a U.S. senator, and not just any senator, one who helped pass legislation shielding religious institutions from financial transparency. Another photo, 1955. A group of doctors in lab coats standing in the basement, smiling, holding vials. Each one bore the insignia of a now-defunct medical research institute shut down in the 1980s for unethical human experimentation. The Blackridge name appeared nowhere in the media, not once. Because they didn't just control the town, they controlled the narrative. Every 17 years, a Thomas was selected, offered, raised, and consumed. And the cycle was protected by donations, scholarships, silence, and fear. The townspeople knew. They always knew. Sarah returned. To Hollow Creek's archives, public records, census data, local newspapers. She found patterns. Families erased from the town ledger in 17-year cycles. Boys who disappeared. Parents who vanished after going public. Headlines like, "Local boy runs away, days before birthday. Family declines to comment. Family home burns down in suspected electrical fire. Former mill worker dies in freak logging accident. No foul play suspected. No obituaries, no graves, just deletion." The system wasn't just about blood, it was about control. You see, they've always understood something most people ignore. The best way to manipulate a society isn't through force, it's through tradition. Make it sacred, make it invisible, make it normal. And once it's normal, no one asks questions. There's a point in every investigation when you realize you're no longer just uncovering the past, you're trespassing on something living. Sarah felt it. The deeper she went, the more Hollow Creek turned cold, not in weather, but in eyes. Doors stayed shut a little longer. Shopkeepers stopped making small talk. Even the local pastor, Father Granger, an aging man with trembling hands, crossed the street when he saw her approach. That's when she noticed it. 17 years, every cycle, like a pulse, a heartbeat, a ritual rhythm the town had absorbed into its bones, and the date was coming again. The last recorded Thomas in the diaries arrived in 2006. He would have turned 13 in 2007. That made 2024, the next year, the next harvest. They were preparing again. And now, Sarah wasn't just chasing ghosts. She was running ahead of the next victim. She checked school records, hospital logs, orphanage registries. The Blackridge Trust still funded a youth mentorship program for disadvantaged boys across the state. The files were sealed, protected under non-profit law, but one file had been left unlocked in a dusty corner of the town hall records room. One name, one boy, Isaiah Miller, age 11, birthday, February 17, 2013, no known relatives, ward of the state. Recently, adopted by a private family foundation listed under an alias, Elmwood Holdings. Sarah traced the paperwork. Elmwood was a shell company owned by the Blackridge Trust. Isaiah had already been moved into the estate, just like the others. It wasn't too late. Sarah made a decision. Once she couldn't walk back, she would break in, rescue the boy, blow the story wide open. FBI, media, the world, she'd drag this hidden empire into the daylight if it killed her. But what she didn't realize is that it already had. Because once you see the system, once you name it, once you expose it, it sees you too. And it doesn't let go. If you're still watching this video, it means you're ready to see it too. But before we go further, I need you to comment below with the phrase, "I see the pattern." Say it twice. Not for the algorithm, for you. To lock this in, to accept that you are no longer asleep. You're not just hearing a story, you're stepping across a threshold. And what comes next will rebuild you, or destroy you. Midnight, February 16th, one day before Isaiah's 12th birthday. Sarah stood outside the Blackridge estate, again, but this time not as an heir, not as a curious journalist, but as a hunter. She had no weapons, only the truth. And that was more dangerous than anything she could have carried. The mansion looked different now. Not abandoned, not old, awake, lit from within by a soft amber glow, curtains drawn, shadows moving, as if the house knew she was there. She circled around the back, flashlight off, relying only on the pale moonlight. The gardens were overgrown, but the stone path still led her to the servants' entrance, the same door she'd once used to escape. It was unlocked. Inside, silence. But a charged silence, the kind that vibrates just beneath your skin, that makes your teeth ache and your pulse drift out of sync. She moved quickly through the halls she'd memorized, past the portrait gallery, where smiling Blackridge ancestors stared down in judgment. Their eyes seemed more alive now, their expressions smug, as if they knew she'd be back, as if they'd been waiting. Upstairs she found the boy. Isaiah. Asleep in the same child's bedroom where Sarah had found the alcove. He looked peaceful, too peaceful. A faint vapor rose from the glass of water beside his bed, drugged. She tried to wake him, nothing. His breath was steady, but shallow, his skin cold, his hands clenched in small, unconscious fists. On the desk nearby lay a handwritten note addressed to the next guardian. It read, "He is ready, the blood is clean, the fear has ripened, do not interrupt the cycle." Signed, with a symbol, not a name, not an initial, a sigil. 3 interlocking spirals inside a triangle, identical to one Sarah had seen in the basement carved into the altar. It wasn't a family crest, it was a seal, and it didn't just belong to the Blackridges. Sarah would later find it on ancient tombs, on church ceilings, on the robes of secret societies, and tucked quietly into the corner of government seals and pharmaceutical patents. This wasn't just about one child. This was a network. And Isaiah, he was next. Sarah scooped him up, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. They had to run. But the house closed in. Doors slammed, lights flickered, and somewhere below, deep in the bowels of that estate, the ritual had already begun. Sarah ran. Isaiah limp in her arms, heart pounding like a war drum, she moved through that mansion as if chased by the house itself. Every creaking floorboard was a scream. Every gust of wind against the windows felt like a warning. She didn't know where to go, only that she had to get out, because something was coming. From the basement, a low vibration began to rise, not a sound exactly, a pressure, like the world beneath the house had begun to hum. Not random, rhythmic, as if calling. That's when the lights cut out. Total darkness. She froze in the hallway, trying to control her breathing. Isaiah stirred faintly in her arms. A whisper escaped his lips. It's time. But he wasn't awake. He was reciting. Something had been programmed into him. A script buried deep in his unconscious, the way the other Thomases had all ended their diaries. It's time. The same phrase echoed through a century. Sarah turned her back to the stairs, refusing to go down. She ducked into a side hallway that led to the old servant's exit. Her fingers brushed the cold brass doorknob. Locked. She yanked. It held. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Measured. Heavy. Not rushed. Whoever or whatever was coming didn't need to run. The hallway was long, narrow, and lined with mirrors. And in every reflection, she wasn't alone. Sarah saw herself, but behind each mirrored version, a Blackridge stood tall. Male, female, old, young. Their faces frozen in time, all watching, all smiling, not at her, but at Isaiah, like he belonged to them. She gritted her teeth, smashed one of the mirrors with her elbow, slicing her skin. Pain flared, blood spilled, but the mirror shattered, and something lifted. The humming stopped, just for a second. It was a clue. Blood. Hers, not Isaiah's. This house didn't want her blood. It wanted his. She wrapped her hand with part of Isaiah's blanket, gripped him tighter, and ran. This time, through the old pantry where she'd once found the basement entrance, she could feel the draft from the cellar, smell the rot rising again. But next to the hidden staircase, a second panel, slightly ajar. Had it always been there? She shoved it open, and there, behind rusted wire and rotted wood, was a tunnel. Narrow, crude, dug decades ago. An escape route. She didn't think. She descended. Behind her, the house howled, not metaphorically, literally, like something alive had woken up. The tunnel was damp, narrow, suffocating. Sarah couldn't stand upright. She crawled through centuries of dust, mold, and the thick metallic smell of old blood. Every scrape of her hands against the stone walls left skin behind. But she didn't stop, couldn't. Behind her, the Blackridge mansion was alive, groaning with rage. The tunnel had been carved with purpose. This wasn't a natural formation. It sloped downward subtly, leading Sarah into the bowels of the property. A path of escape, or something else. Isaiah stirred again in her arms. He whispered another phrase, voice dry, mechanical. The flesh becomes memory. The memory becomes power. Her blood ran cold. It was a chant. Something he'd been taught to say, conditioned. Not from fear, from programming. Sarah reached a fork, two paths, one veering left, descending deeper into earth, and the other climbing slightly toward faint moonlight. The choice seemed obvious, and yet something pulled at her. A voice, not Isaiah's but her own thoughts, warped. Don't go, not yet. Don't you want to know why? It was seductive, authoritative, like an old professor, or a father, or something older. She looked at Isaiah. His eyes flickered open for just a moment. Not vacant, not terrified. Calm, empty. Too empty. And in that flicker of moonlight, Sarah saw it, on the side of his neck. A mark, barely healed, 3 interlocking spirals. The seal. They had marked him already. He wasn't just the next Thomas. He was the final one. This wasn't just another cycle. It was the last. And something in that moment clicked. The 17-year rhythm, the precision, the interlocking timelines, the journals, the sigils. It wasn't just about sacrifice. It was summoning. They had been building to something, collecting blood, memory, energy, feeding it to the house, to the altar, to the thing beneath. Every 17 years was not just more in tenants. It was a construction schedule, a ritual in phases. And Isaiah, he wasn't the sacrifice. He was the trigger. The one born at the right time, under the right sign, during the right planetary alignment. That's why the sigil was burned into his flesh. Not to mark him for death, but to open the door. Sarah understood something then, something no one had dared to say aloud. The Blackridge mansion wasn't a house, it was a vessel, a container, built not to shelter humans but to anchor something ancient, something non-human, something that required blood, memory, fear, to stay tethered to this world. Every Thomas was a stone in the foundation, every ritual a pulse of reinforcement. And now, with Isaiah, they were ready to complete the structure, not with brick and mortar, but with identity. She took the upward path, crawling with Isaiah through the narrowing tunnel. The air grew colder, not from wind, but from absence, like something holy had been vacuumed from the soil itself. Then, light. She emerged behind the overgrown hedges near the estate's southern fence. The mansion loomed behind them, but now it looked less like a house and more like a monolith, unmoving, unfeeling, radiating quiet authority. Sarah collapsed on the grass, panting, bloodied. Her body trembled, but her mind burned with clarity. They couldn't just run. This couldn't be buried again. The ritual wasn't over. She looked at Isaiah, still unconscious, the seal pulsing faintly beneath his skin. "You're not theirs," she whispered. "You're not a key, you're a child." And then, a thought struck her. terrifying in its brilliance. What if the seal could be broken? What if the pattern so carefully followed for over a century could be shattered, not with violence, but with defiance? She remembered the mirror. How her blood disrupted the humming. How her wound was the one thing the house hadn't expected. Isaiah had never chosen this, but she could. She took the knife from her pocket, the same one she'd used to cut the wallpaper, the same one that had revealed the first alcove. She dragged the blade across her palm again, deeper this time, and smeared the blood across the seal on Isaiah's neck. For a moment, nothing. Then, the world shifted. The air bent. The trees trembled. The light around them twisted like oil in water. And far behind them, the mansion screamed, a deep, guttural sound not born of wood or stone, but of something losing its grip. The ritual had been interrupted, not with fire, not with prayer, but with free will, the most forbidden force of all. The scream didn't echo through the forest like sound. It pierced it, like a blade through flesh. Sarah fell to her knees, her body convulsing as the air around her thickened. She tried to shield Isaiah, but the boy was already awake, eyes wide, pupils dilated, staring into nothing. Then he spoke. But it wasn't his voice. "You have broken the seal. You were not meant to bleed." The voice was ancient, not loud, but resonant, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. It sounded like a memory that had waited 1,000 years to speak again. Sarah clutched her head, every nerve alight. This wasn't possession, it was communication. Through Isaiah, something was speaking back. "Do you know what they built, what they fed? Do you understand what sleeps beneath the foundation of blood and debt?" They called it a family, but it was a temple. Every boy, every Thomas was a chapter. Now, the story is incomplete. Sarah screamed into the forest, her voice raw and primal. "Then let it stay incomplete." And just like that, silence. No wind, no birds. The trees stood still as if nature itself was listening. Then Isaiah collapsed, unconscious again, but breathing evenly. Sarah's blood still smeared across his neck. Whatever was anchoring that entity, it had been disrupted, but not destroyed. Because this wasn't just about one ritual or one boy, it was about belief. And Hollow Creek still believed. She stood slowly, watching the horizon. The mansion behind her had gone dark. Windows shattered. A fine mist began to rise from the soil, as if the earth was exhaling something foul. She knew what it meant. The pattern might have cracked, but the system was still alive. And systems don't die from one broken seal. They adapt. She had struck a nerve, a weak point, but now they would rebuild. Smarter, faster, with better camouflage. And next time it wouldn't be a crumbling Victorian mansion in Connecticut. It might be a hospital, a private school, a government program. They would hide behind new names, new funding, new missions. But their goal would remain the same. Control identity, harvest fear, rewrite reality. And if you think this is just a story, if you're still watching for entertainment, then you haven't been paying attention. Sarah didn't go to the police. She didn't go to the press, because she knew, deep in her gut, that if she did, the story would vanish. She would vanish. Or worse, it would be rewritten. Turned into a local myth, a haunted house tale. Reduced to whispers on late-night forums, buried beneath ghost-hunting videos and Reddit speculation. No, this wasn't a ghost story. It was infrastructure. A living, breathing mechanism, fueled by pain, hidden in tradition, and protected by money. She checked Isaiah into a private pediatric care center under a false name, told them he was a survivor of a cult, gave a tip to a sympathetic doctor she trusted. Then she disappeared. Back to Boston, but not to rest, to research. The Blackridge sigil became her obsession. She found it in places no one else had thought to look. Ancient Mesopotamian burial urns, Roman military tombstones, sub-basements of churches that didn't exist on any modern registry. It always appeared in the same form, 3 spirals in a triangle, but with variations, like versions of software. She found it in legal documents from 1903, attached to a now-defunct real estate trust, in a medical research paper from 1987, in the emblem of a European boarding school shut down in 2012 for unethical psychological practices. This thing, this system, it wasn't a family. It was a network. And every 17 years wasn't just about ritual. It was updating, evolving. Just like software, it needed to be refreshed. New host, new blood, new Thomas. The more she learned, the clearer it became. The Blackridges were just one node. The others had different names. The Holloways in Georgia, the Eckharts in Bavaria, the Nakamuras in rural Japan, each with their own ritual, their own Thomas, their own method of feeding the machine. They didn't worship a god. They fed it, and it fed them back. Power, wealth, influence, but more Hanthet, control. Because once you can control identity, once you can sever a child from who they were and replace them with a new story, you don't need armies, you don't need bullets, you have already won. And Sarah, she had stepped into the center of it. She had cracked the shell. Now the thing inside was aware of her, and it was watching. For 3 weeks, Sarah didn't sleep more than 2 hours a night. She tore through every archive she could find, digital, physical, even black market forums that whispered of occult infrastructures and elite rituals passed down like heirlooms. She wasn't looking for stories anymore. She was mapping a system, and one pattern repeated everywhere. Control the boy, and you control the future, not just because he was young, not because he was innocent, but because he could be rewritten. Thomas wasn't a name. It was a template, a shell, a vessel, a programmable identity with no past, no bloodline, no anchors, a clean slate. And that's what they needed. Someone who could be shaped, remolded, and offered as a bridge between their world and ours. She found old transcripts from a government project, Operation Moonlight, declassified only partially. It described a program that targeted orphaned or abandoned boys aged 11 to 13, tested them, then disappeared them. Code word, anchor child. And every name on the list had a check mark next to it, except one, Isaiah. Somehow, he had slipped through, not because of luck, but because of Sarah. That night, while reviewing thermal images of the Blackridge estate from a satellite mapping software, she saw something that nearly made her vomit. The mansion's layout, when seen from above, wasn't random. It was a sigil. The entire structure had been built as one giant geometric invocation. 12 rooms, 3 levels, a central node below ground. The same spiraled triangle burned into Isaiah's neck. It wasn't decoration, it was geometry as gateway. She realized with horror, the house was never haunted. It was possessed by design. A ritual built in drywall and granite, and it had only worked because the world didn't see it. No one sees evil when it wears the mask of inheritance, of tradition, of legacy. They dress it in old money. They polish its wood floors. They call it history. But beneath the chandeliers and Persian rugs is an engine, a sacrificial machine, and every 17 years, it wakes up, to feed, to grow, to write over reality. Sarah sat in the dark staring at her cracked laptop screen and made a decision. No more running, no more researching. She wasn't just a journalist anymore. She was the last interruption, and she knew. They would come for her next. They didn't knock. They never do. 3 nights after Sarah's discovery, they simply entered. Through a back door she had triple-locked. Through windows she'd sealed with steel bars. No alarms were triggered, no cameras caught their faces. Because the people who came for her that night didn't exist on any map. They weren't intruders. They were custodians, preservers of the system. Quiet men in tailored coats and soft shoes. Faces like wax. Voices like static on an old radio. They didn't speak to intimidate. They spoke to rewrite. You've seen too much, Ms. Collins. You've misunderstood everything. She stood her ground, shaking but steady, a flashlight in one hand, her father's revolver in the other. "I know what you are," she said. One of them smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just tired. "You think you're awake now," he said, brushing a gloved hand across her bookshelf. "But you're still in the nursery, still learning how language builds a cage." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her blood had already rewritten the seal. The system had been punctured. That's why they were here. Not to kill her, to recruit her. "We don't destroy interruptions," the man said softly. "We absorb them. We offer them a better truth." And then he opened a folder. Inside, her face, her history, her DNA records, her great-aunt Margaret's real file. The Durnhams were never her family, but the Blackridges were. The name had changed in 1894 after an internal schism in the cult. Half the family wanted to modernize, the others believed in staying hidden. Margaret, she'd been part of the breakaway. Her inheritance to Sarah wasn't random, it was intentional. They had always planned to bring her home. She wasn't the hero in this story, she was the bloodline. And Isaiah? He had been assigned to her, the final Thomas, the perfect pairing of blood and identity, and Tog. Ether, they were supposed to open something older than any mansion. A gate, the man leaned in. "You can still join us. You can become what you were born to be." Sarah closed the folder, stepped back, raised the revolver. "I already am what I was born to be," she said. Then she fired. Not at them, but at the mirror behind them, because the mirror was watching. And she had learned one thing: to break a spell, you don't shoot the puppet, you shatter the reflection. Glass exploded across the room like shrapnel. The mirror shattered into 1,000 jagged truths, and the system screamed. Not the men. The system. The air itself warped. The walls pulsed. Time stuttered like a broken reel of film. Reality hesitated. Because Sarah had aimed not at flesh, but at the surveillance mechanism. Every Blackridge mirror, she now understood, wasn't for vanity. It was ritual glass, scrying tools, gateways, observation nodes. Through them, they watched. Not just the Thomas boys, not just Sarah, everyone. Any place where the sigil appeared on the frame, every antique, every hand-me-down, every estate heirloom with ornate gold trim and spiral accents, it was a camera, not for video, but for presence. She'd seen the pattern, in auction listings, in royal estate sales, in hotels owned by legacy banking families. Every mirror, a set of eyes, every gaze, a form of control. When she shattered it, she felt it, psychically, like she'd just unplugged a piece of the God machine. The men in the room convulsed. One dropped to his knees, another clutched his skull and wept blood. Because they weren't men at all. They were avatars, temporary hosts, shells, puppets built from memory. Without the mirror, they couldn't maintain cohesion. The signal was gone. The puppet strings cut. Sarah didn't wait. She grabbed Isaiah, still groggy, and ran. Out the door, down 3 flights of steps, into the rusted Toyota she hadn't driven in weeks. She drove blind. No GPS, no headlights. Only instinct. Only the road. In the rearview mirror, nothing. No pursuit. Because she'd done something unthinkable. She'd struck at the system from the inside, without permission, without fear. And that's when she realized the greatest secret of all. The Blackridge machine didn't run on blood. It didn't run on wealth. It didn't even run on secrecy. It ran on obedience. Rituals work because people follow them. And Sarah? She'd stopped following. She'd become unpredictable. That made her dangerous, and in the eyes of the system, that made her the enemy. They didn't send men after her this time. They sent symbols. It began with signs in the towns she passed through, old markings carved into telephone poles and bus benches, spiral triangles etched into parking meters, bathroom stalls, even children's drawings taped to gas station walls. Each one slightly different. Each one watching. She wasn't being followed anymore. She was being announced. A warning, a challenge, or an invitation. Sarah knew what they were doing. They weren't chasing her. They were herding her toward the next node, the next ritual ground, the next theater of control. They were letting her run, so she'd lead them to what mattered most. Isaiah. He was the last key, and the system wasn't done with him yet. For days, she drove without a map, sleeping in abandoned barns, communicating only through burner phones. She switched vehicles 3 times, scrubbed her digital footprint, destroyed every device she owned. But the symbols kept appearing. Not just on walls anymore, on her skin. Faint burns along her arms in the shape of spiral scars, marks that bled when she asked questions, that itched when she got too close to something forbidden. Because the system had evolved. It no longer needed puppets. It had coded itself into her reality. Sarah began to see patterns in everything, license plates, receipt totals, clock digits, always repeating 03, 115, 13, Isaiah's birthday, his initiation date, the reset code. The system was counting down, not just to reclaim him, but to reboot itself. It was preparing for its next era, a digital phase, beyond blood, beyond flesh. And Isaiah? He was going to be the first user. Sarah realized something chilling then. They didn't need to sacrifice him. They needed to upload him. His memories, his fears, his entire fractured identity, converted into code and fed into the network like spiritual electrodes. City. If they succeeded, Thomas would no longer be a boy. He would become an interface, an eternal protocol of compliance and transformation distributed globally through screens, devices, and belief systems masked as education or therapy. This wasn't folklore anymore. It was infrastructure, built in whispers, run on fear, hidden in tradition. And unless she burned it down, every boy would become a Thomas, and every Thomas would become a gateway. Sarah had a choice: run and delay the inevitable, or turn around and face the core, because she now understood something most people never would. You don't kill a system like this by exposing it. You kill it by interrupting the ritual, by showing up where you're not supposed to be, and refusing to play your role. She tracked the spiral symbols backward, remapping their origins. All roads pointed to a single location. Not the Blackridge estate, not Millbrook, not even America. It was Switzerland. A nondescript hillside outside Bern, registered to a heritage preservation trust. But Sarah found the blueprints. Underground structures, fiber optic links, biometric access points disguised as a wellness retreat for gifted youth. It was the final node. A modern sanctum, a digital temple for identity control. And inside it, Isaiah's data was already being mirrored. Every emotion, every dream, every word he ever wrote in his journals, scanned and replicated into neural networks designed to mimic human suffering. They weren't going to just upload Thomas, they were going to mass-produce him, and they were starting with Isaiah. Sarah crossed borders using aliases pulled from a Blackridge ledger she'd stolen, a list of shadow identities used to move assets, people, and secrets for over 100 years. She didn't just sneak in, she infiltrated, wearing the system's skin, speaking its language. When she arrived at the facility, it looked like paradise. Smooth glass, soft lights, perfect silence. Children in white uniforms played chess under linden trees, but they didn't laugh, didn't speak. They were already inside the protocol, each one a version of Thomas, a vessel in waiting, and in the center of it all, behind biometric locks and retinal scanners, was a sterile room with a single device, like a modern sarcophagus, lit from within. Isaiah, but he wasn't unconscious. Us. He was awake, and he looked at Sarah, not with recognition, but with glassy, empty eyes. "You're too late," he said. "They gave me a better story." Sarah collapsed to her knees. The pain wasn't physical. It was existential. They had done it. They hadn't killed Isaiah. They had rewritten him. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, gaze unblinking. But something was off. It wasn't just his voice. It was too measured, too flat. It was the absence behind his words. They gave me a better story. Sarah stepped closer, tears flooding her eyes, whispering the name that once made him smile. Isaiah, please. It's me. He tilted his head. That name is deprecated. I am Thomas. Not a nickname. A designation. She looked at the machine behind him. Sleek, pulsing, humming softly like a heart that never skipped. Connected directly to his spine. Wires feeding into the base of his skull. It wasn't extracting memories. It was overwriting them in real time. They had turned the Blackridge ritual into neurosoftware. A transhumanist evolution of the old blood rites. Digital possession. They had taken the same ancient machinery of fear and control and ported it into code. Isaiah was now a carrier, a transmitter, and once the upload was complete, they would deploy the Thomas protocol into every system tied to their infrastructure, school programs, virtual assistants, digital therapies, personality-enhancing apps. Under the guise of emotional optimization, they would roll out a global update, and everyone who installed it would unknowingly install the Blackridge mind. Not a virus, a paradigm. Self-regulating, adaptive, disguised as help. You were supposed to bring me here, Isaiah said calmly. This was your purpose. You were the final bridge. Thank you. That phrase again. The bridge. Sarah remembered the files she had read, the rituals she had documented. The mother figure was always essential. She was the permission, the signature that unlocked the boy's full integration. The system had waited for her, and now that she was here, they could complete the ritual. But she hadn't come to bless this. She had come to end it. With shaking hands, Sarah pulled a small object from her coat. A fragment of the shattered mirror from the estate, still humming with broken sigil energy. You can't overwrite what's been unbound, she whispered. And then she did the unthinkable. She pressed the mirror shard into her own palm. The blood spilled, the machine shuddered, and Isaiah screamed. The scream wasn't human. It was multiplied, like a chorus of digital souls tearing at the fabric of a machine-built reality. Isaiah convulsed, eyes rolling back, wires sparking where they entered his spine. The walls flickered, lights dimmed, the very air fractured, like reality itself was glitching. And Sarah? She didn't let go. She pressed harder. The shard of the Blackridge mirror, still laced with ancient sigil etchings, merged her blood with the forbidden geometry, and in that moment, something ruptured in the source code of the ritual. Because she wasn't just a descendant of the Blackridges, she was a mutation, a flaw in the system they hadn't accounted for. They had programmed obedience, planned for silence, engineered legacy. But they hadn't prepared for someone to be infected with truth. And truth, when sharpened by pain, destroys illusions. Isaiah's body levitated. Every screen in the facility went black. The children outside screamed for the first time. Real voices, not rehearsed affirmations. Their programming was breaking, not because the code was weak, but because someone had cut the power source. Sarah's blood, mixed with the mirror sigil, was incompatible with the system. It caused ritual feedback. Back in the control room, alarms howled in forgotten dialects. Red runes lit the servers. Operators collapsed, foaming at the mouth as symbolic overload flooded their minds. A voice echoed over the intercom, not mechanical, not digital, but ancient. The vessel has rejected the script. The Thomas protocol was collapsing. Isaiah fell to the ground, gasping, eyes wide with real terror. Sarah? Where was I? She dropped beside him, cupping his face. You were in a story that wasn't yours, and I came to end it. They held each other while the world around them burned. Flames erupted from the mainframe, not ordinary fire. This was Mythic fire, born from broken symbols, from rituals interrupted mid-circuit, and with every burst of heat, the Blackridge legacy turned to ash. But they weren't safe yet, because systems like this don't just die. They retreat, regroup, rewrite, and the final failsafe hadn't triggered yet. Sarah looked at Isaiah, eyes finally clear. "We stopped the ritual." Isaiah nodded. "But they still have the script." They escaped through a service tunnel beneath the facility, designed decades ago for maintenance, but in truth built as an emergency exodus for high priests and architects in case a ritual failed. Failure wasn't impossible. They knew that. They planned for it. Because no system this old survives without adaptive failure response. What Sarah didn't know, what no outsider could have known, was that the Blackridge ritual had two layers. The boy was the vessel, but the script was the backup key, and it hadn't been stored on a server. It was written into the architecture of belief itself, etched into oral histories, coded in children's songs, buried inside global folklore and bedtime stories, hidden in plain sight across dozens of cultures. Each culture held a version of Thomas, not always by name, but always by pattern. The gifted child raised by elites, the chosen one removed from their family, the birthday ritual, the transformation at 13, the loss of innocence. Over and over again. A myth disguised as morality, a tale sold as culture. That was the genius of the Blackridge machine. It never depended on one boy, or even one family. It built itself into the world's imagination. So even if the core ritual collapsed, even if Isaiah was saved, the story could still be retold. And every time it was told, through a book, a movie, a social program, the code reactivated. Because the code wasn't lines of data, it was meaning. And meaning is how you control minds. Sarah and Isaiah emerged into the Swiss forest, breathless, bloodied, changed. But the sky above them was wrong. A thin aurora shimmered at the horizon, though it wasn't night. A signal, a transmission. The system was rerouting. They had broken the primary vessel, but the protocol had found new hosts, people already reading the script, already sharing it. Unknowingly turning others into Thomas forms. Not through technology, through language. Sarah realized then that this was never just about a family, or a cult, or even a ritual. This was about a narrative virus, a seed of obedience wrapped in archetype, a machine that runs on belief. And to kill it completely, they would have to do the unthinkable, rewrite the human story. They found shelter in the mountains, an old shepherd's cottage with no electricity, no reception, no mirrors. The silence was complete. For a moment it felt like freedom. But freedom, Sarah realized, is a fragile thing. Especially when your mind isn't your own. Isaiah didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window whispering to himself, not in English, not in any modern tongue, but in the ritual language of the protocol. "Is this you, or them?" she asked gently. He turned, eyes clouded again. "It's just inside now. I don't want to speak it, but it speaks me." The system hadn't just uploaded him, it had rewired his intuition. The symbols were still running in his subconscious, rebuilding pathways, like malware that didn't destroy files, just renamed them. She wanted to scream, wanted to tear it out of him. But how do you fight a belief embedded in someone's very sense of identity? "I think I remember the original Thomas," Isaiah whispered. "The first one. He didn't want this either." Sarah froze. "What do you mean, remember?" "I see his dreams, his thoughts, his code, like I absorbed him when they tried to overwrite me." He looked at her, trembling. They didn't just create a new boy every 17 years, they copied the same soul over and over, bound it in symbols, bound it in obedience. Now it made sense. Why every Thomas wrote in the same way. Why they all felt the same fear on the night before their 13th birthday. It wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. Each boy wasn't new. He was the same entity, resurrected through ritual, soul cloning, bound to bloodlines, bound to architecture, bound to the script. And the first Thomas? He was trying to wake up inside Isaiah. Sarah reached out slowly, held Isaiah's face between her hands. Then we don't just have to save you, we have to free him too. Because the original Thomas, he wasn't a victim anymore. He was the root code, the keystone consciousness, and if they could unbind him, remove his echo from the system entirely, then the whole protocol, the entire Blackridge legacy, would collapse. But doing that would mean entering the one place they swore never to return, the ruins beneath the mansion. Where the first ritual was born, the mansion still stood. A hollow carcass, blackened by fire, windows shattered, roof partially collapsed. Nature had begun reclaiming it, ivy crawling up the walls, owls nesting in the eaves. But it wasn't dead. No, it breathed. Even from a distance, Sarah and Isaiah felt the pulse beneath the earth, the rhythm of old rites, of something unfinished. The first ritual had been performed here, and somewhere beneath the foundations was the original binding chamber, where Thomas's soul was first split, copied, and chained to the Blackridge bloodline. To undo the system, they had to reach it. The basement door was gone. Fire had consumed most of the interior, leaving only scorched beams and cracked stone. But Isaiah remembered. There's a path beneath the well. Sarah stared at the crumbled garden fountain. It had always seemed decorative, an old iron well with rusted chains, but Isaiah knelt beside it, pressing his palm against the stones. The spiral triangle was there, etched inside the rim, invisible to the untrained eye. Still humming. Still waiting. They pulled the chain. The stone floor beneath the fountain split, revealing a narrow passage choked with roots and cold air. A scent rose from the dark, familiar and terrible. Oil, salt, blood. They descended without light. Because this wasn't a place you illuminated, it was a place you remembered. And Isaiah remembered everything now, every cycle, every binding, every moment the protocol had split him into echoes and shadows. It happened here, he whispered, in this soil, in this stone. At the bottom of the passage, the corridor widened into a chamber, perfectly circular, walls covered in black glass, and in the center, a stone cradle, like a manger for a god no one should worship. Sarah approached it slowly, her breath clouded in the freezing air. Inside the cradle, bones, small, human, arranged precisely in the shape of a spiral triangle, a child's remains. The first Thomas, Isaiah said. Not metaphor, not memory. Him. The real body, the original soul vessel. And as Sarah reached out, she heard it, a voice that wasn't sound, not in her ears, but in her mind. Unbind me, unbind me. The voice echoed not in decibels, but in intention. It wasn't asking, it was begging. Sarah's knees buckled, not from fear, from recognition. This wasn't just Thomas's voice. It was the voice of every boy who'd ever been chained to the protocol, layered, bleeding into one another. A symphony of stolen lives. Isaiah knelt beside the cradle of bones, his fingers trembling as he reached toward the skull, no bigger than a grapefruit, jaw still curled in the silent scream of a child who died obeying. They told me I was chosen, Isaiah whispered, but I was just next. Sarah pulled the mirror shard from her coat pocket, blood-stained, jagged, still humming with broken sigils. This time, it wasn't for cutting, it was for severing. Because rituals bind through pattern recognition, through sacrifice remembered. But the mirror, it held a record of the ritual broken. What happens if we destroy the body? Sarah asked. Isaiah shook his head. It's not enough. They anchored him to the story, not just the remains. The bones were symbolic, but the binding lived in belief, in the endless retelling. To truly unbind Thomas, they had to erase the origin point of the myth itself, and that meant invoking it, not avoiding it. Sarah stood, took a breath, and began to speak. March 15th, 1910. A boy is taken from a debtor family and brought into the Blackridge house. He is named Thomas. He is fed, clothed, schooled, loved, but he is never free. Isaiah joined her. On the eve of his 13th birthday, they lead him below. He thinks it's a rite of passage, a family tradition, but it's a harvesting. Their voices wove together like counterspells. He is drained not of blood, but of self, bound to sigils, copied into journals, fragmented across generations. Each boy that follows is him, but not. The chamber trembled. The black glass walls cracked, the stone cradles. He shuddered. The world forgot his real name, replaced it with Thomas, made it legend, and in doing so, kept him trapped in the echo. Sarah stepped forward. But I remember now, I speak it now. She held the mirror shard to the bones and whispered the original name, a name never spoken aloud in 113 years. Elijah. The cradle exploded into ash. The explosion wasn't fire. It wasn't light. It was release. A thunderous undoing that shook the ritual chamber at its roots, not collapsing it, but disassembling it. As if time itself was unspooling the stone, the symbols, the architecture, unwriting the prison it once built. The black glass walls shattered in complete silence. Ash spiraled upward, not falling, but rising, as if gravity had given up holding something so anciently wrong. Isaiah fell back, clutching his chest. "It's gone," he gasped. "The weight, it's gone." Sarah knelt beside him. "He's free." The whisper came again, faint this time, no longer desperate. "Thank you." And then, nothing. No whispers. No hums. No pulse. The ritual engine beneath the Blackridge line had finally stopped beating. But what replaced it wasn't peace, because something else had awakened. The void left behind by the binding wasn't empty. It was waiting. Waiting for the next belief to take root. The next story to occupy the hollow Thomas had once filled. Because that's the danger of myths. You can kill a character, burn a body, unbind a soul. But if you don't replace the story, the system finds another script. Sarah looked around the ruins, sigils crumbling, bones dissolving, time collapsing inward, and realized they were not just witnesses. They were now authors. The unbound essence of Thomas, Elijah, was loose in the symbolic strata of human thought. His pain, his memories, his longing for freedom. Someone, somewhere would feel it, dream it, write it, and maybe corrupt it again. "We can't let them retell it," Sarah said. "We can't let them rebuild him." Isaiah nodded. "Then we have to tell the story first, and tell it right." But telling the truth wouldn't be safe. It would mean speaking of rituals and bloodlines, of soul binding and identity theft. It would mean exposing systems that still exist in new forms. Digital, corporate, cultural, systems that prey on belief. If they told the real story, the world wouldn't thank them. It would come for them. But that didn't matter anymore, because when you hold the truth in your hands, you don't get to walk away clean. You either bury it again, or you light the fuse. They didn't go back to Boston. They didn't go anywhere familiar. Instead, Sarah and Isaiah disappeared into the deep web of the world, unseen villages, abandoned observatories, off-grid towns that didn't show up on GPS. Because the truth they now carried. It wasn't information. It was a contagion. Once you understood the Blackridge system, Once you saw how myths were used to engineer behavior, bind souls, and erase identities, you couldn't return to a normal life, because normal life was part of the machine. Sarah began documenting everything, the rituals, the timelines, the false Thomases. She built a non-digital manuscript, coded in hand-drawn symbols and reconstructed languages, something that couldn't be deleted, tracked, or rewritten by algorithms. She called it the Book of the Unbound. But this was no diary. It was a counterscript. Because stories, real stories, don't just entertain. They program. They shape perception. They shape who we are allowed to become. And if the world had been fed a lie about obedience, sacrifice, and silence for 113 years, then it needed a new myth, one forged in resistance. But Isaiah had changed. He no longer flinched at memories, no longer recited sigils in his sleep. Instead, he saw patterns, deep, symbolic patterns in media, institutions, brands, education, things most people ignored. The protocol never ended, he told Sarah one night. They just moved it. To where? To the collective imagination. They weren't binding children to families anymore. They were binding entire generations to identities, fabricated ones, sold through screens, reinforced by fear. The new protocol didn't need rituals in basements. It had hashtags, it had diagnoses, it had content pipelines. And every time someone accepted the role given to them by a system they didn't create, a new Thomas was born. Different name, same cage. S. Oh, how do we stop it? Sarah asked. Isaiah looked at her, calm now. We tell our story, and we speak the phrase. She nodded, and for the first time they said it aloud, together. A phrase meant to fracture the illusion, to signal awakening. I am not the story they wrote. Again, louder. I am not the story they wrote. It wasn't just a mantra. It was a weapon. That phrase spread like wildfire in the places algorithms feared to go, not through mainstream platforms, not through polished influencers, but through the cracks, message boards, encrypted voice chats, handwritten pamphlets left in subway seats and prison libraries. I am not the story they wrote. It started showing up in places no one could trace. Spray-painted beneath corporate billboards, carved into park benches, whispered between strangers on overnight trains. It wasn't just rebellion. It was recognition. Like waking up in someone else's body and finally realizing it wasn't yours. Sarah and Isaiah didn't need fame. They didn't need proof. All they needed was for people to start remembering. That identity is assigned before it is ever discovered. That every system, from the education you receive, to the heroes you're given, to the fears you're taught, is part of a narrative economy designed to keep you playing a role you didn't write. The Blackridge ritual was just the prototype, the real machine. Modern life. Boys raised to obey because obedience was branded as honor. Girls raised to disappear because silence was sold as virtue. Families pressured to conform. Thoughts filtered by fear of offense. And above it all, institutions harvesting identity, not with stone altars anymore, but with data, with dopamine, with daily compliance. Thomas had never been a boy. He was an idea. The perfect subject. Grateful, fearful, powerless. And every time you accepted the labels given to you, every time you bowed to systems pretending to be your saviors, you became Thomas again. That's why the phrase mattered. Because it wasn't denial, it was declaration. I am not the story they wrote. It meant, I will not be defined by trauma disguised as tradition. I will not inherit shame like it's a birthright. I will not obey scripts written by architects. I'll never or meet. And as it spread, something changed. People began remembering themselves. Old instincts returned. Curiosity, rage, clarity. Men woke up from lives they didn't choose. Women broke chains they were told were gold. Even children started asking questions the system couldn't answer. Not because of Sarah, not because of Isaiah, but because a story had ended, and the new authors were finally arriving. In the months that followed, the world didn't collapse. It fractured. And not along lines the architects expected. Not politics, not religion, not class. It fractured along consciousness. Those who heard the phrase, truly heard it, started asking impossible questions. Questions you were never supposed to ask. Who benefits from my obedience? Why was I taught to hate my own instincts? What part of my personality is actually mine? In boardrooms, executives noticed a subtle shift in consumer behavior. Click-through rates dipped. Loyalty plummeted. Their models didn't account for disenchantment. In schools, children began refusing the roles assigned to them, no longer passive, no longer programmable. In courts, defendants referenced the phrase in bizarre testimonies, claiming not insanity, but reclamation. And all across underground networks, the Book of the Unbound circulated in fragments, pages faxed, photocopied, encoded into graffiti, each chapter decoding another layer of the control systems, the myth of the benevolent state, the silent war of narrative repetition, the invisible economy of identity theft, the mass sedation of ambition through ritualized failure. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a myth dismantled. And just like that, the world lost its grip on one of the oldest, most powerful spells ever cast. This is just how life is. People stopped believing that, stopped accepting suffering as sacred, stopped worshipping systems that promised belonging in exchange for becoming invisible. But the architects didn't stay silent. Oh no. They responded quickly. New scripts flooded the media. New Thomases, just flashier, more diverse, more empowered. But the rhythm was still the same. Obey, adapt, comply. They tried to discredit the phrase, labeled it dangerous, an extremist symbol. But it was too late. Because the people who had once said, "I am not the story they wrote," had already started writing something else, something unprogrammable. Because once you taste unbound identity, you can never go back to chains. Not everyone woke up. That's the part they don't tell you. For every man who broke the spell, a dozen clung tighter to the script, because waking up isn't comforting, it's annihilation. It means admitting the life you've lived may have been a cage, that the job, the family structure, the politics, even your personality, might have been installed by design, not destiny. Better the lie I know, they whispered. Better Thomas than no one at all. These were the ones who defended the system, even as it bled them dry. They mocked the phrase. They parroted terms like conspiracy, grifter, narcissist, and cult. But beneath the ridicule, fear. Because deep down, they felt it too. That unspoken question, what if I'm not who I think I am? But that fear is precisely what the architects feed on, because they don't control people through violence anymore. They use identity dependency. They convince you your entire sense of self, your race, your nation, your trauma, your preferences is sacred and fixed, when in truth, it's programmable. You think you're unique? They coded your rebellion. You think you're awakened? They sold you that too. Unless you've gone all the way down. Past pain, past belief, past even self-love, and stood in the raw silence of the unbound soul. Most people never get there, because there's no applause at the bottom, no audience, no tribe, just you, naked, free, and terrifying to the machine, because a man who doesn't need a role can't be weaponized. Sarah understood this. Isaiah embodied it. And together, they became something rarer than rebels or saints. They became mythbreakers, not storytellers, deprogrammers. They didn't offer new truths. They burned the altar of truth itself, because in a world ruled by narratives, sometimes the greatest act of freedom is to stop believing altogether. The final pages of the Book of the Unbound weren't instructions. They were mirrors. Not literal ones, but symbolic. Ritualized sequences designed to confront the reader with the one thing every system fears: unfiltered self-awareness. It began with a single line, repeated 3 times. There was a version of me that never gave consent. Read that too fast and you'll miss it. But read it honestly, and something starts to shatter. Because every identity you hold, your name, your culture, your memories, was given to you before you could say no. And the moment you question that, you become dangerous. That's why those last pages of the book were encoded in dream logic, instructions for rituals that never happened, maps to places that don't exist, names of people who were erased before they were born. It wasn't gibberish. It was a trapdoor, a way to slip beneath the surface of perceived reality and see the structure that holds it up. Sarah called it the root script, the ancient operating system beneath human thought, older than religion, older than language, older than even fear. The root script isn't spoken, it's imposed. It says, you are small, you are broken, you need permission to be whole. Every institution, every symbol of control, from governments to gurus, echoes that original programming. Because if you believe you're broken, you'll always seek repair outside yourself, and they will always be waiting. The book's final act was to collapse that lie. Not with arguments, but with mirror triggers, fragments of language so primal they bypassed logic and hit the subconscious like lightning, and when read aloud slowly in the right state of mind, they did something no system could reverse. They unwrote the root script, not all at once, not easily, but permanently. Isaiah was the first to say them aloud, under a full moon, alone in the ruins of the Blackridge mansion. He came back changed. Not possessed, not enlightened, just free. And freedom, real freedom, isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't need a movement, it just is. Freedom, once felt, becomes unbearable to forget. That's the hidden cruelty of awakening. You can never unsee the strings. You can never again call the puppeteer God. And worst of all, you can never go back to being Thomas. Because Thomas had purpose. He was chosen. He was part of a tradition. He was sacrificed for something greater. But the unbound man, he belongs to nothing, and that's where most break. They claw back toward the old cage, toward systems that give them rank, ritual, role. But Isaiah didn't break. He walked deeper into the void. Not as a wanderer, but as a map. He became a living cipher, an embodiment of every boy who was ever taken, erased, renamed, silenced. Not to relive their pain, but to reverse the ritual. They didn't just bind souls, he once said. They bound meaning. And meaning is the most dangerous currency in the world. If you can assign meaning to a sacrifice, call it divine, necessary, heroic, then no one sees the blood. But Isaiah stripped meaning from everything. He tore the sacred labels off war, off family legacies, off personal trauma, and held them in his hand like dead skin. None of this made me, he said. I was already whole. That was his final rebellion. Not to expose the Blackridge family, not to dismantle the secret system, but to stand in full clarity, look the architects in the eye and say, you never had me. That is how the system dies, not in fire, not in chaos, but in irrelevance. Because when a man no longer needs permission to exist, when he no longer clings to titles, tribes, or trauma for identity, he becomes unreadable to the machine, untraceable, unpredictable, unprogrammable, and the system hates what it cannot map. Sarah documented every step, not to publish, but to protect, to pass forward the exact vibration of the path, not a book, a frequency, the resonance of waking up without anger, without vengeance, without fear. Just the steady, unstoppable hum of a soul that remembers itself. The mansion was gone by then. Burned, collapsed, reclaimed by the land, no one knows. Some say it vanished the moment Isaiah spoke the final sequence aloud. Others claim the townspeople tore it down in secret, afraid of what might still live in its stones. But the truth is simpler, it dissolved. Because structures built on lies don't need sledgehammers, they just need to be seen for what they are. And once the illusion collapsed, so did the house. Sarah returned one last time, not to investigate, not to film, but to bury something. Wrapped in linen and wax, she placed the original diaries of the boys, Thomas, 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 in the soil beneath the ruins. Not as tribute, but as witness. Because history doesn't need to be rewritten, it needs to be unburied. You see, the myth of the Blackridge family isn't unique. It's not even rare. It is the archetype of every institution that hides violence behind legacy, behind wealth, behind tradition, behind family names carved into stone. They all have a Thomas somewhere, some boy who disappeared to make the story cleaner, and some girl, some Sarah, who heard the whisper anyway and chose to follow it. So the question isn't whether this story is true. The question is, whose house are you living in? What walls have you never touched? What rooms remain locked in your psyche? What diary is buried under your beliefs? Because this isn't about the Blackridges, it's about you. What role were you assigned before you were conscious enough to refuse it? What scripts still run in your head when the world is quiet? What lies do you still call love? This isn't history, it's a mirror, and once you've looked into it, you don't get to pretend anymore. The house is gone, but the system, it still breathes, in offices, in schools, in churches, in algorithms, until you say the phrase, until you become the phrase, I am not the story they wrote. There is no going back after that. Once you say it, really say it, the system feels you, like a tremor beneath the skin of the world, because it's not just words. It's a severance, a final break from the inherited soul mask they gave you at birth. You stop being a product, stop being a projection, stop being a player in someone else's script. You become something older than identity, older than fear. You become aware, and awareness is contagious. Isaiah didn't stay hidden. He moved through the world like an anomaly, unlabeled, unowned. Cameras glitched around him. Systems failed to predict him. Even faces in crowds seemed to forget him moments after he passed. He wasn't a ghost. He was unwritten. And Sarah, she became the voice behind the veil. Her words leaked into places that mattered, not trending feeds but private journals, not headlines, but whispered questions. She didn't spread panic, she spread doubt, the kind that rots systems from the inside out, the kind that turns employees into saboteurs, turns believers into skeptics, turns sons into free men. Because once doubt sets in, the rituals collapse, the sacrifices cease, and the altars go cold. The phrase began appearing again, subtly, beautifully, on bookmarks in prison libraries, on dog tags in VA hospitals, etched into the casing of a USB drive left at a Wall Street cafe. It was a quiet insurgency, not of violence, of remembering, because the system didn't fall when it was exposed. It began to fall when people saw it and chose not to feed it. When men stopped offering their sons, when women stopped swallowing the silence, when children stopped fearing the locked door. That's how it ends. Not with war, with starvation. A ritual, after all, requires participation. Withdraw your consent, and the whole machine begins to rust. Isaiah said it best before he vanished for good. They don't need to kill you if they can convince you to play dead. So wake up. Not to rage, not to revenge, but to the most dangerous power a human can possess. Sovereignty. Sovereignty is not a flag. It's not a birthright. It's not gifted by law or blood or creed. It is claimed, through fire, through silence, through the unraveling of every sacred lie that ever kept you small. It means walking away from the altar they built for your obedience. It means refusing to be Thomas, even when the world begs you to bow again. Sovereignty is dangerous because it can't be monetized. You don't need a subscription for it. No app, no certification, no movement. You need only one thing: the courage to stand in front of the void and not flinch. Isaiah knew that. In his final journal entry, found months after his disappearance, he wrote, "If you're reading this, you've already started to remember. Don't stop. They'll call you broken. They'll call you dangerous. They'll offer you comfort in exchange for your clarity. Decline every offer. And then You are the last altar. Burn yourself clean. That line haunts me, because it speaks to the final ritual, the one they never want you to complete. The destruction of the false self. All the layers you wear to be loved. All the masks you wear to be safe. All the roles you accepted just to survive. They must go. Not gently. Not symbolically. Burn them. Because behind them, there is something vast, something wordless, something immune to indoctrination. You. The you that existed before programming. The you that no system could predict or punish. The you that was buried under centuries of curated shame. And when that self rises, the rituals die, the houses fall, the myth-makers lose their grip, because they never feared exposure. They feared your return. They feared the moment you would look in the mirror, not at your titles, not at your traumas, not at your story, but at your unwritten soul. And remember, I am not the story they wrote. And now you stand here, at the end of their story, at the edge of the house, at the mouth of the void, one breath away from becoming unreadable. This isn't where the horror ends, it's where you begin. Because this was never about the Blackridge family. Not really. They were just a vessel, a mirror, a mask. The real system, the ancient one, the one that fed on obedience, on shame, on the sacrifice of sons. It's still here. It's the job that drains you and tells you its purpose. It's the family that demands silence and calls it love. It's the nation that asks for loyalty and gives you a label. It lives in every false choice, every sanitized history book, every promise of salvation that begins with submission. But now you see it. That's the difference. Now it can't hide. And more importantly, now you can't hide either. You've heard the phrase, you've followed the echoes, you've seen the basement, you've read the diaries, you've stared into the mirror and felt something stir, something vast, ancient, wordless. Yourself. So what happens now? That depends. Some will walk away. Too much. Too strange. Too dark. They'll scroll to safety, and they'll return to the house. Back to the walls. Back to the story. Back to sleep. But some of you, you'll speak the phrase. Not just once. Not just for comments or clicks, but as a ritual, a severance, a return. Say it now, if you're ready. Say it twice, aloud or within. I am not the story they wrote. I am not the story they wrote. And feel what happens. Feel the quiet. Feel the split. Feel the house begin to tremble, because the system can survive rebellion. But it cannot survive indifference. And it cannot survive a man who remembers who he was before the world told him what to be. This isn't the end of the video. It's the start of your unscripted life. No altars, no cages, no Thomas. Only you. Unbound.